Hi, I'm Nick Cartwright. As well as being a university lecturer, I'm also the branch chair for our trade union, meaning that I offer an awful lot of advice and support to our members on employment matters. And since the outbreak of the coronavirus, I've been asked by a lot of people to offer advice, support, or give some general guidance. The point of this recording is not to give specific advice to specific circumstances, but to give some general overviews of the issues you should be thinking about and exploring when faced with perhaps difficult questions from your employer. First of all, we do need to understand that these are unprecedented times and that employers are going to struggle. We may feel some sympathy for our employers, and that may be well founded. But it is also worth reflecting on what happens in your work situation when things go particularly well. So if your employer is asking you to share in the pain at the moment, have they actually shared the gains when things have gone well? Something to reflect on when you're considering whether or not to essentially surrender some of your employment rights to help out your business. So there are three things that I'm aware of that people are being asked to do during this Covid-19 or coronavirus pandemic. The first is to sign up for a period of unpaid leave. The second is to agree to something called layoff. And the third is to agree to something called furlough. And I'll take each of those in turn. Firstly, if you are being asked to agree to a period of unpaid leave, it is unlikely that your contract allows your employer to impose a period of unpaid leave. Or that it does, but your employer has said they would rather you volunteered for it first. The important thing to remember is that if you volunteer to take a period of unpaid leave, you may have agreed to give up some of the benefits that you would otherwise be entitled to. So even if your employer is saying that there is a term in your contract that means that they can impose a period of unpaid leave, it may be better for you to ask them to impose it than for you to volunteer to accept it. One of the ways that an employer can impose unpaid leave is something called layoff. And layoff clauses are in some contracts of employment where the employer anticipates that there will be periods when they don't have enough work for their workforce, and therefore they would lay you off for a period of time. If an employer enforces a layoff clause, and for this to happen there would have to be a layoff clause in your contract, so they can't just create something that isn't already in the agreement. But if there were a layoff clause and they were to enforce it, then they can enforce that for a period of time you remain employed but you are not paid because there is no work for you. You should then, of course, take advice, and you should also be thinking about taking benefits advice, because there is a statutory layoff benefit that is available to some people who've been put on layoff, and it may affect your entitlement to other benefits. If you've got a layoff clause and your employer is asking you to agree to a period of voluntary unpaid leave before enforcing the layoff clause, or instead of enforcing the layoff clause, then it is worth asking what the terms of this are, getting that in writing so that you've got a paper copy of it, and asking to be allowed to seek advice. Because it may be that volunteering changes your entitlement to certain things. A good employer would never refuse an employee the opportunity to take away something in writing, to seek advice and to come back. A bad employer will try and put pressure on you. And I have heard in these difficult times certain employees saying that they were told they must sign up for unpaid leave or they would be sacked. Now, we haven't suspended employment law. Employment law still applies to contracts of employment, and employers, regardless of what they think, can't simply fire people willy-nilly. There is law in place that prevents wrongful dismissal, that prevents unfair dismissal. So generally, if an employer wants to get rid of you, there will be a notice period within the contract for which you will be entitled to be paid. If you've worked for the employer for a period of time, depending on what that time is, you may be entitled to redundancy payments, and they may have to go through the whole process of making you redundant. But all of this is something that a good employer would be willing to discuss with you, to negotiate, to explain what the options are. And there should be no harm at the moment in what are acknowledged as difficult times for people being open, transparent, and honest with each other. And you can ask that of your employer. As well as layoff, employers are also looking at furlough. And furlough is something that we've perhaps all become aware of more recently because it's a term that the government have been talking about because they're setting up a scheme to support employers in making furlough payments. Now, furlough is similar to layoff, except that your employer is paying you during a period of furlough. So a period of furlough is when your employer pays you essentially to stay at home and not work for them, because at that moment the work that they had for you is not there anymore. Some contracts do include a furlough clause allowing your employer to do this, but that's quite rare. So it's worth checking your contract, but it is unlikely there would be a furlough clause in it. If there isn't a furlough clause in it, then again, this is something that your employer should be negotiating with you. They should be asking you if you are willing to accept furlough. And in the current environment, they may be suggesting that as an alternative to beginning redundancy procedures. So it's definitely something that's worth considering. The government have suggested that they will support furlough to around 80% of most people's pay packets. So if your take-home pay is £2,500 a month or less, then they're looking at a furlough payment of around 80% of your take-home pay in order to support your employer. Now, that furlough payment isn't to you. That furlough payment is to your employer to give them the funds to retain you rather than to make you redundant. And it is up to you whether or not you agree to accept furlough at 80% of your pay, or whether or not you think that your employer can afford maybe a little bit more, or in fact whether or not your employer should be paying you 100% of your pay. And before you agree to anything that results in a reduction of pay or a change in your terms and conditions, you should be seeking advice. If you're a member of a recognised trade union, great. Go and speak to your trade union and they will be able to give you advice. If you're not a member of a trade union, then you may be able to get advice from other sources, although you may have to pay for that. So just to conclude, nobody should be agreeing to a change in terms and conditions, to taking unpaid leave, where they feel rushed, threatened, or unable to take advice. A good employer will explain things clearly, will explain why, and will allow you to go and seek independent, impartial advice about what you should do under the circumstances. So I hope that helps. If it has, please like, share. If there's other things you want to know a little bit more about, then please ask in the comments below and I shall do my best to answer your queries. Thank you for listening.